The ring felt cold against her skin. It was a simple band of white gold, heavy and unforgiving, a permanent fixture on a hand that was not her own. Betty traced the edge of the marble island in the cavernous kitchen. Her fingers gliding over a surface so polished it reflected the city lights like a dark, frozen lake. This was her new home, a cage gilded in chrome and glass, 30 floors above the streets of New York. The marriage contract had been signed 3 days ago. Her father's crushing debts to the Rossi family were erased, settled not with cash but with his only daughter. She was a transaction, an asset moved from one ledger to another. Her husband, Marco Rossi, had not touched her. He had barely spoken to her. He moved through the penthouse like a phantom in a tailored suit, his presence a pressure drop in the air, his silence more menacing than any threat. He was a man carved from shadows and old-world authority, and he looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture he had not chosen. She was supposed to be invisible, a silent testament to a deal honorably concluded. But the silence was eating her alive, and she was hungry. The staff, a rotating cast of silent, efficient figures, prepared food that was technically perfect and emotionally void. It was food for fuel, not for comfort. Tonight, the emptiness of the penthouse echoed the gnawing in her stomach. Sleep was a distant country she could not reach. She pushed herself off the island and moved toward the commercial-grade refrigerator. Its stainless steel door was cool and impersonal. Inside, it was organized with a precision that felt sterile. Sealed containers of vegetables, perfectly butchered cuts of meat wrapped in white paper, bottles of mineral water lined up like soldiers. It was a kitchen with all the right ingredients and none of the soul. On a lower shelf, however, behind a block of imported cheese, she found what she was looking for. A forgotten bag of onions, a few cloves of garlic, a can of crushed tomatoes, and a half-empty box of pasta. Simple things. Real things. Working in the dim glow of the under-cabinet lights, she moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that felt like a secret language. The slice of the knife through the onion was a clean, satisfying whisper. The sizzle of garlic hitting hot olive oil was a sound that grounded her, pulling her back into her own body. She had learned to cook at her grandmother's side, her hands covered in flour and her heart full of stories. It was the one part of her old life, her real life, that she could still access. The aroma began to fill the vast, empty space. Oregano and basil, the sweet scent of simmering tomatoes, the rich depth of garlic. It was the smell of home, of safety, of a love that asked for nothing in return. She drained the pasta, tossed it with the sauce, and slid it onto a plain white plate. She ate standing at the island, the city a glittering, indifferent backdrop. For a few brief, stolen moments, she was not Betty Rossi, the Mafia boss's bartered bride. She was just Betty, and she was home. That was when she heard the soft scuff of a shoe on the marble floor behind her. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. A young man stood in the doorway, dressed in the dark suit and earpiece that marked him as one of Marco's guards. He was barely older than her, with tired eyes that widened slightly as the scent of the sauce reached him. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to disturb you." He looked at the plate in her hands, a flicker of something she could not name in his expression. It looked like longing. Betty looked from his face to her plate, then back again. She said nothing. Instead, she turned, took down another plate, and served him a generous portion of the pasta. She pushed it across the island toward him. His eyes met hers, wide with surprise. "I made too much," she said quietly. It was a lie, but it was a kind one. He hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. He picked up the fork she had set out for him and took a bite. He closed his eyes. A genuine, unburdened sigh escaped him. "My mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It tastes like my mother's." She watched him eat, this soldier in her husband's silent army. She had thought she was a ghost in this house, but she had just fed one of its keepers. And in the shared, silent appreciation of a simple meal, a crack appeared in the sterile foundation of her new life. The next night he was not alone. The young guard, whose name she learned was Leo, stood in the doorway of the kitchen with an older, broader man named Luca. They both had the same hesitant, almost sheepish expression. They looked like two stray dogs hoping for a scrap. "Ma'am," Leo began, his gaze flicking toward the stove. "Luca here." He was saying how he missed a real meal. Betty looked at them, these two men who carried guns to protect the man who owned her. They were part of the cage, the bars that kept her locked in this life. But in their eyes, she saw the same simple human hunger she felt in herself. A hunger for something more than survival. She nodded once, a small, sharp gesture. "I was just about to start," she said. It became their ritual, a secret communion held in the dead of night. She would cook, and they would appear silent and watchful at first, then slowly relaxing in the warm, fragrant air of the kitchen. They never spoke of Marco. They never spoke of the business that happened outside these walls. Instead, they talked about their families, about the neighborhoods they grew up in, about the foods that reminded them of home. She learned that Leo's mother still sent him care packages from Queens, and that Luca's wife made the best cannoli in the Bronx. She cooked what she knew: hearty lasagna, rich and bubbling with cheese. Simple spaghetti aglio e olio, fragrant with garlic and chili. Chicken cacciatore that stewed for hours until the meat fell off the bone. It was peasant food, soul food. It was love simmered down and served on a plate. For Betty, the kitchen became her territory. The rest of the penthouse was Marco's domain, a cold museum of his power. But the kitchen was hers. It was the one place where she had agency, where she could create, where she could give something of herself and see it received with genuine gratitude. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a provider. One night, a third man joined them. His name was Angelo, and he was older, quieter, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was one of Marco's most trusted capos, a man whose silence was as heavy as a loaded gun. He did not ask for food. He simply stood in the doorway and watched her work. Betty's hands faltered for a moment. This was different. Leo and Luca were soldiers. Angelo was command. She finished plating the pasta for the younger men and, without a word, prepared a third plate. She set it on the island in front of the empty stool where Angelo stood. He watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, he slowly walked over, sat down, and picked up the fork. He ate the entire plate without saying a word, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he pushed the plate away, looked directly at her, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not thanks. It was a sign of respect. It was Luca who said it first a few nights later. He was finishing a bowl of her pasta fagioli, a thick bean and pasta soup that smelled of rosemary and comfort. He leaned back in his stool with a contented sigh. "Mama Betty," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "You take care of us." Leo grinned. "He's right. My own mother doesn't feed me this good." The name settled in the air.
Mama Betty.
It was absurd. She was 22 years old, a prisoner in this house, the wife of a man who barely acknowledged her existence. But to these men, these hardened soldiers of the Rossi family, she was becoming something else. Something more. She had thought she was simply surviving, carving out a small space for herself in the dark. She hadn't realized she was building an empire of her own, right in the heart of his. The click of the penthouse elevator arriving was a sound that always set her teeth on edge. It meant he was home. Usually, it came late, long after her secret kitchen gatherings had dispersed. But tonight it was early, dangerously early. Betty was at the stove, stirring a pot of simmering bolognese sauce, the rich aroma a comforting blanket in the air. Leo, Luca, and Angelo were seated at the island, nursing glasses of water and talking in low, easy tones. The atmosphere was relaxed, a small pocket of domestic peace carved out of a violent world. When the elevator doors slid open down the hall, the change was instantaneous. 3 soldiers, who moments before had been debating the merits of a baseball team, straightened their spines. The easy smiles vanished, replaced by masks of professional deference. Marco Rossi strode into the kitchen, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. He stopped dead in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His wife at his stove. 3 of his most trusted men sitting at his kitchen island like they were at a neighborhood trattoria. A half-empty bottle of red wine she'd used for the sauce stood on the counter. The scene was so jarringly, intimately domestic that it felt like a violation. His eyes, the color of dark, bitter coffee, moved from his men to her. There was no anger in them. Not yet. There was something colder. A chilling, predatory stillness. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Leo, Luca, and Angelo rose to their feet as one. "Boss," Angelo said, his voice a respectful rumble. "We were on security detail." Marco's gaze did not leave Betty. He walked further into the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble. He stopped beside the island and looked down at the empty plates. "Security detail," he repeated, the words flat and devoid of inflection. He picked up a clean fork, dipped it into the pot on the stove, and tasted the sauce. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his expression unreadable. He placed the fork down on the counter with a soft click. "Get out," he said, not looking at his men. The 3 soldiers vanished without another word, melting back into the shadows of the penthouse from which they had emerged. The silence they left behind was heavy and suffocating. Marco turned his full attention to Betty. She stood frozen by the stove, the wooden spoon still in her hand. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. "You think this is a game?" he asked, his voice a low threat. "You think you can win them over with a plate of pasta? Make them your friends." "I was hungry," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "They were hungry." He laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "Hunger. You know nothing about hunger." He moved closer, invading her space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and cold, like gunpowder. "Loyalty in this world is not bought with a meal, little bird. It's bought with blood. It's earned in fear." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I had a man I trusted once. I called him my brother. I brought him into my home, let him sit at my table. I fed him, and he sold me out to my enemies. He smiled in my face while he was digging a grave for my real brother." The pain in his voice was a raw, jagged thing, a wound he kept hidden beneath layers of ice and control. "So you will forgive me if I don't appreciate you playing house with the men whose lives depend on their absolute, unquestioning loyalty to me. Not to you." He saw her as a threat, a manipulator, a weakness in his defenses. He saw the same potential for betrayal in her that he had seen in the man who had cost him everything. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid, and his fear was more dangerous than any anger could ever be. "They are loyal to you," she said, finding a sliver of courage. "Eating my food doesn't change that, doesn't it?" he countered, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. "They come in here, they eat, they talk. You make them feel comfortable. You make them feel at home. A soldier who feels at home is a soldier with his guard down. And a soldier with his guard down is a dead man." He straightened up, putting a formal distance between them again. "It stops. Now, you are my wife. You will act like it. You are not the house cook." His words were a command, an ultimatum. He was shutting down her kitchen, her one sanctuary. He was taking away the only piece of this life that she had made her own. The transaction was being called to account. She was his property, and she had forgotten her place. The days that followed were taught with a new kind of tension. The late-night visits to the kitchen ceased. The men she had come to know as Leo, Luca, and Angelo were once again silent figures in dark suits, their faces impassive, their eyes avoiding hers. The penthouse reverted to its former state, a cold, sterile showcase of wealth, utterly devoid of warmth. Betty felt the loss like a physical ache. She was a ghost again, haunting the hallways of her own life. Then the world outside the penthouse walls intruded. Marco grew more distant, more dangerous. He came home later, his suits smelling of cigar smoke and the city's cold night air. The number of guards in the penthouse doubled. Conversations happened in hushed, urgent tones behind the closed doors of his office. Betty pieced together the fragments she overheard. A rival family, the Falcons, was making a move. A shipment had been hit. A territory dispute was escalating toward war. The house was put on lockdown. No one in, no one out without Marco's direct approval. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, a low hum of violence waiting to be unleashed. The men were on edge, subsisting on catered trays of dry sandwiches and lukewarm coffee. Their exhaustion was a palpable thing, their nerves stretched thin. Betty watched from the periphery, a silent observer to the tightening siege. She saw the fatigue in Leo's eyes, the tense set of Luca's jaw. These men were preparing to risk their lives for her husband, and they were running on empty. She could obey Marco's command. She could stay in her room, stay invisible, stay safe. It would be the smart thing to do, the sensible thing. But as she stood in the doorway of the silent kitchen, looking at the pristine, unused appliances, a different instinct took over. It was not a calculated decision. It was a primal, defiant urge. This was her territory, and her territory was being threatened, not by the Falcons, but by the fear and exhaustion seeping through the walls. She walked into the kitchen and turned on the lights. She pulled out the largest pots she could find. She worked with a focused, furious energy, chopping onions, browning meat, crushing garlic. She wasn't just cooking. She was fighting back in the only way she knew how. She was forging armor out of flour and water, building a fortress out of rosemary and thyme. She made vats of bolognese, enough to feed an army. She baked loaves of crusty bread, the scent filling the sterile air with life. She made a massive pot of coffee, strong and black. When she was done, she didn't wait for them to come to her. She carried the food out to the living area where the men were stationed, setting up a makeshift buffet on a polished mahogany table. They stared at her, then at the food, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. They looked toward the hallway that led to Marco's office, expecting him to emerge and unleash his fury. But he didn't. Slowly, one by one, they came forward. They filled their plates, their movements stiff and uncertain at first, then with a growing, grateful urgency. The sound of forks scraping against plates replaced the tense silence. The men ate with a quiet reverence. She was not just feeding their bodies. She was restoring their morale. She was reminding them of what they were fighting for. Not just territory or money, but home, family. She was refilling a platter when Marco finally emerged from his office. He stopped, just as he had that first night, taking in the scene. His men, his soldiers, gathered in his living room, eating her food. But this time, his expression was different. The cold anger was gone, replaced by something she couldn't decipher. It was a complex mixture of astonishment, frustration, and something else. Something that looked almost like grudging respect. He walked over to her, his presence silencing the room once more. He stood before her, the scent of simmering tomatoes and fresh bread clinging to her clothes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He saw not the girl his enemy had sold him, but a woman of unexpected strength, a quiet commander holding her own kind of court. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took a piece of bread from the platter in her hands. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, sharp and electric. He held her gaze for a long, charged moment, the sounds of the city far below them, the unspoken tension a living thing between them. In that moment, the battle lines shifted. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had defied him in his own home, and he had let her. The name followed her like a whisper through the penthouse.
Mama Betty.
It wasn't just Luca and Leo anymore. She heard it from the new guards, the ones brought in as reinforcements. She heard one of Marco's men say it on the phone, his voice low and respectful. Mama Betty is taking care of it. It wasn't a joke. It was a title. It was a rank. In a world built on a rigid hierarchy of men, She had been given a place of honor, a position she had earned not with violence, but with garlic and oil. The knowledge of it settled deep in Marco's eyes whenever he looked at her. It unnerved him. He understood power that came from the barrel of a gun, from fear, from money. He did not understand the power she wielded from his kitchen. It was a foreign currency, and she was spending it freely, winning the loyalty of his men in a way he never could. He had ordered them to obey. She had made them want to protect her. The Falcons, his rivals, were not stupid. They had eyes and ears everywhere. They learned of the strange domesticity that had taken root in the Rossi fortress. They learned of the boss's new wife and the unusual affection his men held for her. And where Marco saw an anomaly, they saw a vulnerability. An opening. The lockdown had eased slightly, the immediate threat having subsided into a tense stalemate. Betty, needing ingredients that the household staff could never find, was permitted a trip to a small, family-run Italian market in the Bronx. A place that smelled of aged cheese and cured meats. She went with Leo and another guard, a thick-set man named Paolo. The trip was a risk, but she had insisted. The kitchen was her domain, and it needed to be properly supplied. The market was crowded, the air alive with the music of shouted conversations and laughter. For a few moments, surrounded by the familiar sights and smells, Betty felt a pang of a life she had lost. A normal life. It was a dangerous feeling. Nostalgia was a distraction, and in her world, distractions were fatal. It happened fast. A black sedan screeched to a halt outside the market. Two men with hard faces and guns drawn burst through the door. There was no warning. Panic erupted. Shoppers screamed and dove for cover. Leo shoved Betty behind a large display of olive oil tins, his body shielding hers. "Stay down!" he yelled, drawing his own weapon. Paolo was already returning fire, providing cover. But one of the attackers had a clear line of sight to her. He raised his gun, his eyes locking on Betty. This was not random. This was an assassination. She was the target. Leo saw it. He moved without hesitation, stepping directly into the path of the bullet meant for her. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and staggered back, his hand flying to his shoulder where a dark red stain was already blossoming on his white shirt. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. In the chaos, as the second attacker turned his attention toward the now wounded Leo, Betty acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could reach, a 5-pound bag of flour from a nearby shelf, and threw it with all her strength at the man's head. The bag burst on impact, exploding in a cloud of white powder. He staggered back, momentarily blinded and disoriented. That was all the opening Paolo needed. A single, clean shot ended the threat. The remaining attacker fled, tires screaming as the sedan sped away. The entire event had lasted less than 30 seconds. The market was a wreck of shattered jars and terrified people. Leo was on the ground, conscious but bleeding, his face pale with shock. And Betty stood over him, her hands trembling, covered in a fine dusting of white flour. She had not screamed. She had not hidden. She had fought back. She had crossed a line, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that she could never go back. The ride back to the penthouse was a blur of sirens and frantic radio calls. By the time they arrived, Marco was waiting for them in the private underground garage. He took one look at Leo being helped from the car, his shirt soaked in blood, and then his eyes found Betty. He moved toward her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. But beneath the anger, she saw something else flicker in the depths of his eyes. A raw primal fear. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruisingly tight, and pulled her toward the private elevator, leaving his men to deal with Leo. The ride-up was silent, the air thick with unspoken violence. When the doors opened to the penthouse, he dragged her inside, not to the living room, but straight to her bedroom. He threw her inside and slammed the door, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. He stood before her, his chest rising and falling, his control finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He seethed, his voice a low growl. "You and your ridiculous trips to the market?" Your little cooking club. They tried to kill me, she said, her voice shaking but steady. Of course they tried to kill you, he roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. You are my wife. You are how they get to me. Did you think this was a game? He paced the room like a caged tiger, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He stopped and turned to face her, cornering her against the wall. Do you have any idea what they would have done to you? What they would have sent back to me in pieces, just to prove a point? The words hung in the air between them, brutal and terrifyingly honest. This was not a confession of love. It was a confession of ownership. A confession of what she now represented in the brutal calculus of his world. She was his weakness, his vulnerability, and the thought of losing her, of what his enemies would do to her, was driving him mad. She met his furious gaze without flinching. The terror of the attack was still coursing through her veins, but it had burned away her fear of him. You brought this world to my door, she said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. My father sold me to you to fix his mistakes. You put this ring on my finger. You put your name on me. Don't you dare pretend you're surprised when your enemies come knocking. Her defiance stunned him into silence. He stared at her, seeing not the frightened girl he had married, but the woman who had blinded an assassin with a bag of flour to save one of his men. The silence stretched, thick with a tension that was no longer just about fear. It was something else, something deeper and far more dangerous. Finally, he spoke, his voice ragged with an emotion he could not name. It's over, he said. No more. You are forbidden from the kitchen. You will not cook for my men. You will not speak to them unless necessary. You will stay in this part of the penthouse. You will be a ghost again. It is the only way to keep you alive. He thought he was protecting her. He thought he was putting her back in her gilded cage for her own safety. But he was wrong. He had just confirmed the one thing she had started to suspect. Her power in this house was real. It was so real it had made her a target. It was so real it terrified him. And he had just tried to take it away. That was a mistake. He had shown her the weapon she held, and now she knew exactly how to use it. The war with the Falcone family was coming to a head. Marco was preparing for a sit-down, a supposed negotiation with Vito Falcone, the head of the rival family. It was a classic move, a meeting to discuss terms that was almost certainly a trap. Marco knew it. His men knew it. But to refuse the meeting would be a sign of weakness he could not afford to show. He had to walk into the lion's den, knowing the door would likely be locked behind him. His preparations were meticulous, surgical. He spent his days in his office planning contingencies, studying maps, and speaking in low, coded language on encrypted phones. His most reliable inside source within the Falcone organization, a man who had fed him information for years, had gone silent. Marco assumed the worst. The man was either dead or had been turned. He was going in blind, and the tension in the penthouse was a palpable, living entity. Betty was confined to her wing of the apartment, a prisoner once more. But she was not idle. The silence from the kitchen was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. She watched and she listened, and she knew something that Marco, with all his tactical brilliance, did not. His silent source was not dead. The man's name was Enzo, and he was Luca's first cousin. She knew this because Luca, during one of their late-night kitchen talks, had spoken of his cousin with a mixture of pride and fear. He'd worried aloud about Enzo, who had married into a Falcone-connected family and was in deep, playing a dangerous game. It was the kind of incidental, human detail that men shared over a bowl of soup, the kind of information Marco's world of suspicion and paranoia would never uncover. She had to get a message to Marco, but she could not go to him directly. He would see it as a trick, a desperate bid for relevance. He had walled himself off, trusting only his own grim calculations. She had to use the network she had built, the one he had tried to dismantle. She found Paolo, the guard who had been with her at the market, the man whose life she had helped save. She asked him for a favor, a simple one. Could he get a message to Luca's wife? She wanted to send her a recipe, a gesture of goodwill, for a speedy recovery for Leo. Paolo hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Marco's direct orders and the debt he felt he owed her. He looked at her, at the quiet determination in her eyes, and made his choice. He agreed. Betty wrote down her grandmother's recipe for Sunday gravy, a rich, complex meat sauce. On the back of the card, she wrote a simple, personal note to Luca's wife, wishing the family well. But within the recipe itself, she embedded the message. She altered the cooking times and temperatures to a sequence of numbers. A street address. She changed an ingredient from 1 large can of San Marzano tomatoes to 2 large cans, a signal for 2 o'clock, and she added a final instruction at the bottom. For best results, serve at the old place, not the new one, a warning. The sit-down location was a decoy. The real ambush would be somewhere else. It was a desperate gamble. It relied on Luca's wife understanding the hidden meaning, on her being able to get the message to Luca, and on Luca being able to get it to his cousin Enzo. It was a chain of trust built on family and food, a language Marco had forgotten how to speak. The day of the sit-down arrived, gray and ominous. Marco left the penthouse with his most trusted men, his face carved from stone. He was a king walking toward a guillotine, resolved and ready. Betty watched from her window as his armored car disappeared into the city traffic. All she could do now was wait. The hours ticked by, each one an eternity. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Then, late in the afternoon, the private elevator chimed. Her heart leaped into her throat. The doors opened, and Marco stepped out. He was alone. His suit was disheveled. There was a cut on his cheek, and he smelled of cordite and victory. He had not gone to the sit-down. He had gone to the ambush. Her message had gotten through. Enzo had confirmed the location. Marco and his men had turned the tables, dismantling the Falcone attack with brutal, lethal precision. The war was over. He didn't go to his office. He didn't pour himself a drink. He walked straight down the hall and into the kitchen. Betty was standing there, by the cold stove, waiting. He stopped in front of her. The city lights began to flicker on behind him, creating a halo around his dark form. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, complex emotion she had never seen before. It was awe. It was fury. It was a profound, earth-shattering respect. "They call you Mama Betty," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw. It was not a question. It was a concession, an admission of a power he had underestimated, a force he had tried and failed to control. She simply nodded, unable to speak. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently cup her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. "My mother's name was Elisabetta," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Everyone called her Betty. It was the most profound secret he possessed, a piece of his past he had shared with no one. He was not just acknowledging her title. He was acknowledging her. He was seeing her, finally and completely, as the woman who had saved him, the queen who had won a war from his own kitchen. The cost of that victory was etched into the following weeks. Luca's arm was badly broken in the final confrontation, a permanent reminder of the price of loyalty. The peace with the remnants of the Falcone family was fragile, a treaty written in blood that could be broken at any moment. This world was never truly safe. Nothing was ever truly won. But something fundamental had shifted within the walls of the penthouse. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the low murmur of life. The kitchen was no longer her secret sanctuary. It was the heart of the Rossi organization, the true seat of power. His men moved through it with a comfortable reverence, their loyalty to him now inextricably tied to their fierce, protective loyalty to her. One evening, weeks later, Marco sat at the kitchen island, watching her cook. He no longer saw a transaction, a debt paid. He saw the architect of his victory, the woman who had understood his world better than he did. She moved with a quiet confidence, her hands sure and steady as she stirred a pot of risotto, the scent of saffron and parmesan filling the air. She finished cooking and placed a plate in front of him. He picked up his fork, the motion familiar, comfortable. This was their new ritual, a quiet communion that was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any vow. He had chosen this life of violence and power long ago. She had been forced into it, a pawn in a game she never asked to play. She sat down across from him with her own plate. She looked at him, at this dangerous, complicated man whose life was now tied to hers. For the first time, it was not an arrangement dictated by others. It was not a contract to be endured. She looked at him, met his dark, intense gaze, and she made a choice. She picked up her own fork. She stayed. And in his world, that was the only oath that truly mattered.